The crowd froze. Donald Trump's grin slipped as Barack Obama leaned forward, voice steady, eyes unblinking, dropping a revelation that turned whispers into headlines. It wasn't politics. It was personal. Secrets, lovers, and the truth colliding under studio lights. The question that followed left America gasping, what else has been hidden? Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The PBS Boston studio was cloaked in an almost surgical calm. Ice blue lights washed over the stage, leaving the audience in a hush that felt less like anticipation and more like dread. On the lower third graphic, words burned across the screen. Exclusive, Barack Obama with Karen Delaney. The cameras were locked in, trained on a man who had spent years balancing composure with gravity. This time, though, there was no campaign trail, no rally roar, no presidential seal behind him. Just a chair, a microphone, and the weight of what he was about to say. Obama leaned slightly forward, fingers resting loosely on his knee, and spoke with the steady cadence of someone choosing each word like it might alter history. "Respect for the office only matters if the office is respected in return," he began, eyes narrowing with precision. "Tonight, I'll talk about a relationship advisors once called the soft spot." The studio air seemed to thin instantly. Karen Delaney, the seasoned host, froze mid-breath, her Hebrews listed questions. Behind the glass, producers exchanged frantic looks, their hands darting between control panels as if searching for a way to dial back what was already unleashed. A boom mic above trembled from the operator's hand, betraying the tension that rippled through the room. Obama did not flinch. His tone never rose, never cracked. "It wasn't just politics," he continued, his voice carrying the chill of restrained anger. "It became a lever, and levers move nations." For a fraction of a second, even the cameras seemed to hesitate, the lens pulling tighter on his eyes, as if compelled to reveal the force behind them. The soundscape itself shifted. The studio's natural noise fell into a heavy heartbeat hush, leaving only Obama's words puncturing the silence. Karen Delaney's pen rolled off her notepad and clattered softly against the desk, the lone imperfection in an otherwise suspended moment. The audience sat rigid, their silence not of courtesy but of shock, bodies instinctively braced for the blast they knew was coming. And then, with no warning, the feed cut to black, replaced by bold, jagged text. "When private becomes leverage, public trust pays the price." The message hung in the air like a verdict, daring viewers to absorb its weight. In that instant, it was no longer a whisper. The silence had broken. After leaving office, Barack Obama embraced a quieter rhythm. He built libraries, hosted policy forums, and engaged in the deliberate work of teaching young leaders how to govern with restraint. For years, he avoided the circus of partisan mudslinging, understanding that every word from a former president still carried the weight of the nation. His discipline was almost monastic. He knew that speaking too freely risked overshadowing his successor, even when he disagreed deeply. For a time, silence seemed like the noblest contribution he could offer. Yet as the years passed, restraint began to feel less like dignity and more like complicity. Obama's own inner compass was simple: tell the truth when silence endangers the public. That maxim had guided him through crises abroad and scandals at home. But now, watching from the sidelines, he felt that withholding certain truths had allowed something corrosive to fester unchecked. The office was being bent into something transactional, where personal entanglements could be leveraged as tools of power. In flashbacks, the fragments of that danger appeared in stark detail. Security briefings during his final months in office noted unusual anomalies, patterns that didn't align with protocol. Analysts flagged what they called non-standard access surrounding a private companion tied to Trump's travel schedule. Staff notes captured in bureaucratic shorthand spoke of unofficial visits, off-book overlaps, and unvetted proximity. Alone, none of it screamed catastrophe. Together, it painted a portrait of a vulnerability hiding in plain sight. The most sobering warnings came from Ethics Council. In neatly worded memos, they outlined the potential danger. Personal ties may pose leverage vectors. That phrase, so antiseptic on the page, carried an unshakable implication. If someone had private access without vetting, Their presence could become more than companionship. It could be a fulcrum for influence, a shadow channel by which decisions were shaped or information compromised. Obama struggled with the weight of this knowledge. He was caught between two obligations: the dignity of not embarrassing the country with salacious details, and the duty of not allowing the country to remain blind to a clear vulnerability. Every time he leaned toward silence, he replayed one question in his head. What happens if this secrecy is one day exploited, and no one can say they weren't warned? His conscience gnawed at him, reminding him that truth withheld in the name of respect could be weaponized against the very democracy he swore to defend. At last, he chose a path of careful disclosure. He would not name names, nor reduce the matter to gossip. Instead, he would frame it as a question of risk, of leverage, of what happens when private life bleeds unchecked into public power. In doing so, he sought to respect personal dignity while also protecting collective trust. And in that balance, he prepared himself to speak out, knowing full well it would ignite a firestorm. While Obama wrestled with conscience, Donald Trump operated in a different reality altogether. Mar-a-Lago functioned as his fortress, a gilded bubble where television screens filled every wall and velvet ropes kept ordinary questions at bay. Inside the compound, urgent whispers floated among aides, each day a new battle to defend the image of unshakable dominance. The fortress thrived not on policy, but on perception, not on governance, but on narrative. Trump's inner circle reflected this reality with absolute clarity. Colby Dent, his fiercely loyal press secretary, devised the first line of defense almost instantly. Make it about Obama's jealousy, frame it as a smear campaign from a bitter ex-president. To Dent, everything could be explained as envy or sabotage, and the goal was never persuasion but saturation. Flood the airwaves with counterclaims, and the original story would drown in the noise. In the Capitol, allies like Representatives Maddox and Briggs promised they would stage hearings to protect the family from supposed invasions of privacy. Their real objective wasn't truth, but shielding the figurehead of their movement from reputational wounds. By promising institutional muscle, they reinforced the narrative that any scrutiny was persecution and any question a betrayal. Even Trump's legal whisperers kept the strategy narrowly tailored. If he doesn't name anyone, deny everything, attack the motive, question his patriotism, say Obama is undermining the office itself. The calculus was simple. So long as the rumored companion was never identified, the entire scandal could be painted as baseless innuendo. The less Obama specified, the more Trump's defenders could fill the silence with bluster. Yet beneath the walls of spin, the details lingered. At social events and private fundraisers, a glamorous +1 often appeared, her presence threaded through travel rosters and photographs, though never on official White House readouts. She was unnamed in the record, but always there, her visibility both undeniable and unacknowledged. The story was never about romance. It was about access. When a private individual bypassed vetting protocols to orbit the highest levels of power, it became a matter not of love, but of leverage. Trump's reflex was always the same: transform scrutiny into betrayal. To him, privacy was synonymous with impunity. To question his personal entanglements was to attack his sovereignty, and to challenge his sovereignty was to attack America itself. The cycle was predictable and brutal. Accusations became theater. Theater became outrage. Outrage became proof of persecution. And yet, foreshadowed in the files of a forgotten security aide, one note stood out with chilling precision. Unvetted proximity creates predictable pressure points. It was a warning that described the heart of the danger. When those pressure points were exposed, they could be used to bend power itself. Obama knew it, Trump denied it, and the stage was set for the confrontation that would soon rock the nation. The lights inside the studio glowed with a deliberate warmth, but the air was thick with anticipation. Karen Delaney, a veteran journalist known for her steady voice and sharp timing, leaned toward the former president with a question that carried the weight of millions of viewers. "Mr. President," she began carefully, "you've been cautious for years, avoiding public clashes and letting others speak. What changed?" Barack Obama's expression was calm, almost contemplative. Yet his words cut with the precision of a blade. "When a private relationship becomes a public lever, it stops being private," he said, his tone even but heavy with implication. For a moment, the studio seemed to contract as if the walls themselves leaned in to hear the rest. Karen, keeping her composure, pressed with the urgency of a nation watching. "Are you alleging influence, Mr. President? Influence over the highest office?" Obama's reply was neither sensational nor evasive. It was deliberate. "I'm saying decisions began bending around an orbit that never appeared on the official map. You didn't see it in the briefings, but you felt it in the outcomes." The silence that followed was broken only by the most human sounds. A cough echoed from row 3. A pen slipped from the fingers of a young producer and clattered against the floor, louder than it should have been. Every camera stayed locked on Obama, each lens catching the subtle steadiness in his posture. Inside Karen's earpiece, a producer whispered with urgency, "Stay on him. Do not cut. Do not shift." It was clear this was the moment the show had been waiting for. Obama leaned forward slightly, his boundary sharp but his tone controlled. "I will not name a private individual," he clarified, anticipating the frenzy of speculation already bubbling beyond the cameras. But the pattern mattered. Access that was never vetted, timing that always aligned, and doors that opened without clearance. Karen inhaled, ready to ask more, but the segment time had run its course. The director made the choice to cut to break, and the network soundtrack swelled with tense strings. Across the country, phones buzzed as viewers texted each other in disbelief. Did he just say what I think he said? Did Obama just accuse him without saying the name? Is this real? What had begun as a restrained interview had cracked open into something more. A careful line had been drawn, not across the details of a private life, but across the principles that private life could not become a public lever of power. That distinction, sharp and unavoidable, was now in the bloodstream of the conversation. The spark had been lit and the fire was already spreading far beyond the studio walls. When the program returned from its short break, Karen Delaney's face betrayed the pressure of the moment. Her voice remained steady, but her complexion carried a paleness that came only with the awareness of history unfolding in real time. She leaned in, eyes fixed on Obama. "Mr. President," she said, "you're asserting that the national interest was compromised by an unnamed personal tie?" Obama nodded once, unhurried. "I am asserting," he answered, "that personal ties were treated like policy tools, and that is not leadership, it is leverage." His words landed with a gravity that no chyron could soften. He did not speak in abstractions. Instead, he laid out specifics without ever crossing into names. Flight manifests that don't match the schedules released to the public, guests without badges who appeared near sensitive briefings, policy pivots that coincided precisely with private meetings. His cadence was clinical, yet his voice came with unmistakable weight of lived responsibility. Karen held her breath for a second, then glanced at her notes. "And you believe this altered national decisions?" she asked. Obama leaned back slightly, letting the silence do part of the work. "I believe patterns reveal themselves, and the pattern here was not accidental. It was consistent, deliberate, and dangerous." The internet reacted in an instant, as though detonated. On one side of the screen, the broadcast displayed Obama's measured face, his voice clipped into viral soundbites. On the other, social feeds erupted. Hashtags formed like lightning bolts. Soft spot, leverage, not love, private, access public risk. Within minutes, trending lists across platforms were dominated by variations of the same theme. Legal analysts rushed onto split screens to interpret the unfolding moment. "He's threading the needle," one observed. "He's not straying anyone. He's not straying into rumor. He's presenting a concrete pattern of exposure and vulnerability," another added. "This isn't gossip, this is the language of risk assessment, and he's delivering it with the authority of a man who has read those memos." Meanwhile, inside the Trump camp, phones began melting under the pressure of calls. Aides barked instructions into headsets. "Go now. Call in anywhere. Don't wait for booking. If there's a camera, get on it." The directive was clear. Flood the zone before the narrative settled. But the images were already fixed. Obama's face, calm and deliberate, contrasted with the screaming urgency of chyrons in bold red. The questions weren't about romance, or even about loyalty. They were about national exposure. The idea that a personal tie had become an unchecked policy lever was now undeniable in the public conversation. In the control room, the producer repeated the mantra, "Stay with it, do not pivot. This is the story now." And outside, America leaned in closer, caught between disbelief and the dawning realization that a boundary had been crossed in full view of history. The counterattack arrived within the hour, a volley of all-caps fury fired directly into the bloodstream of social media. Donald Trump's first response came not through surrogates, but through his own fingers. "Obama cannot stand that I am loved." The words appeared on screens everywhere, clipped and looped against the footage of Obama's calm stare. The contrast was cinematic, one measured the other, unrestrained. From there, the surrogates swarmed. Television panels filled instantly with loyal defenders armed with talking points. "Obama hates love," one claimed with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Another insisted, "This is an attack on a family man, pure envy." The talking points collided with one another, but the mission was clear. Drown the charge in emotion, make it about jealousy and privacy rather than leverage and vulnerability. Obama, still seated in the studio, delivered his final line of the night with a quiet force that silenced even the control room. "This is not about anyone's private life," he said. "This is about vulnerability. If the presidency can be pushed by private leverage, then every American is less safe. That is the only point that matters." His voice dropped on the last word, and for a moment the entire audience seemed to exhale as one. Karen Delaney, who had spent her career navigating storms, leaned slightly off mic and whispered to her producer, "We've never aired anything like this." Her words carried both awe and trepidation. She knew this interview would define not just the night, but perhaps the political season itself. Beyond the studio, the foreshadowing signs gathered quickly. White House allies began drafting statements built around the word privacy. They framed the defense not as a denial of the pattern, but as an attack on the principle of questioning personal relationships. "Every American deserves privacy," one drafted line read. "Even presidents have the right to a personal life free from harassment." The shield was forming before the ink had dried. Yet in the quiet corners of Congress, whispers grew louder. Committee aides traded messages about memos that might be revisited, flight records that could be subpoenaed, staff logs that no one had bothered to reconcile. Investigations did not roar to life overnight, but the embers of oversight were stirring. And in homes across the country, viewers replayed the moment, some in shock, others in vindication. One thing was certain: Obama had drawn a line, and Trump had answered with fury. The clash was no longer hypothetical. It was public, visible, and impossible to retract. The first blows had landed, and the fight for the narrative of power had begun in earnest. Obama's words didn't ripple. They detonated. By dawn, every network looped the same sequence. His steady posture, Karen Delaney's half-second freeze, the line already echoing through living rooms. When a private relationship becomes a public lever, it stops being private. Producers slowed the clip, rewound it, framed it with chyrons that read oversight or intrusion and privacy. Local affiliates teased it before weather and traffic, then handed back to national panels clutching printouts and clearing throats. Pundits tried to turn the moment into a horse race and discovered the camera itself refusing to blink. Late night tried levity and landed on unease. One host joked, 911, what's your emergency? An unvetted +1 slipped past the velvet rope. The crowd laughed, then quieted as the host leaned forward. We're kidding because it's absurd. But the question isn't, did access become leverage? Applause came uncertain. The sound you hear when people feel the floor shift beneath them. Explainer culture went to work. TikTok creators dropped crisp, animated breakdowns of access vectors, guest lists compared to badge logs, travel overlaps mapped against policy pivots, donor rooms that moonlighted as corridor diplomacy, threads tagged soft, leverage not love, and flashing press passes, then cut to screenshots of visitor protocols. The message was visible without anyone naming a single name. Leverage lives where secrecy invites it. Civics teachers seized the moment. In classrooms from Tucson to Toledo, whiteboards carried the prompt, map a trust chain. Teams drafted what must be public when private relationships intersect public duty. Basic visitor logs, declared conflicts, audit trails for off-book meetings. Some students argued for privacy first. Others pointed to historic failures born from secrecy. Teachers didn't referee the answers. They graded the rigor. Op-eds split down a fault line. One camp praised courage without cruelty, noting Obama refused to name a private individual and kept the lens on institutional vulnerability. The other accused him of character assassination by insinuation, warning about a politics of implication. Yet even several critics admitted the framing was maddeningly disciplined. No gossip, only governance. Talk radio fed on adrenaline. Callers demanded names, hosts demanded proof. Analysts cautioned that patterns, not persons, were the point. Podcasts turned the moment into curriculum, interviewing former ethics lawyers who explained how unvetted proximity becomes a predictable pressure point. By evening, the detonation felt architectural. The conversation had migrated from "is there a rumor" to "could hidden intimacy bend policy?" A Baltimore bus driver summed it for a commuter podcast, voice fatigued, conviction clean. "I don't care who loves who. I care who gets to whisper past security and move my country by inches." The clip kept looping, not because it was salacious, but because it was surgical. In a media culture addicted to spectacle, restraint had become the loudest sound in America. International outlets chimed in with their own calculus. A London anchor asked whether U.S. security protocols had softened into suggestion. In Berlin, a correspondent compared the moment to past European scandals where pillow talk allegedly brushed policy. Sydney talk shows debated the line between myth-making and risk management, all while rolling the same 5 seconds of Obama's calm. Tonight, the country divided not into neat halves, but into overlapping circles of instinct, experience, and caution. In a Baton Rouge barbershop, a customer shook his head. "If it's romance, it's none of my business." His barber paused the clippers. "If romance opens doors the rest of us can't walk through, that's everybody's business." The shop hummed. The debate kept its tempo, and no one walked out angry. They just kept cutting and listening. On a factory floor in Youngstown, earplugs dangled from necks as the lunch bell rang and phones lit up with the looped clip. A welder said, "I don't trust politicians, period." A supervisor countered, "Trust isn't the point. Leverage is." A third voice, older, quieter, "Leverage gets soldiers hurt." Everyone nodded without looking up. Meetings turned into civic salons. In Bakersfield, a mother asked whether visitor logs could be public without exposing private addresses. In Charlotte, a dad who rarely spoke raised his hand, saying he'd lost a cousin to a war that started with whispers. The room fell still, then reopened with ground rules. No names, no threats, only standards. Flash polls reflected the texture on the ground. Independents leaned toward uncomfortable but necessary, uneasy with insinuation but unwilling to excuse vulnerability. The base hardened along reflex lines. Moderates wobbled between decorum and danger, unsure whether breaking a silence broke a norm or upheld one. Pollsters wanting to fuse volume with consensus. Messages flooded inboxes, once considered ceremonial. Veterans wrote, "We fought to keep foreign leverage out. Don't let it walk through the residence." Teachers added standards, not rumors. Show the receipts that matter. Logs, clearance, compliance. A nurse from Dayton typed on her break that she didn't care who loved whom. "I want to know who signs people in after hours." Quiet grief surfaced where cameras rarely linger. A military spouse posted a paragraph without hashtags. "If this made us vulnerable, I deserve to know. Not for gossip, for sleep." A pastor in Tulsa preached a homily titled "The Difference Between Mercy and License," reminding a crowded sanctuary that compassion for private life does not absolve public duty. Teenagers turned the moment into projects. One Texas sophomore diagrammed a power proximity flow chart with sticky notes. Another in Vermont built a spreadsheet of historical moments when secrecy sheltered influence. Debate teams found themselves agreeing on the premise while feuding over the remedy. The homework felt less like homework, more like rehearsal for citizenship. Caroline Leavitt watched in the hash light of a home office, phone face down between takes of a podcast she decided not to do. That old, volcanic silence from her own on-air freeze lived in the glow of her screen. She scrolled from the hashtags to the faces and landed, finally, on a grandmother in El Paso reading a letter aloud. Public office is a trust. Love who you love, but don't sell my vote for it. Caroline didn't share it. She just breathed. In diners, the argument returned to a single fulcrum. If it's just romance, leave it alone. If romance becomes leverage, we can't. 2 sentences. 1. Country. The lines didn't move so much as clarify, like fog retreating off a coastline, revealing dangerous shoals and safe channels both. People chose their routes. The ocean did not change. The maps did. In union halls, whispers hardened into motions for transparency. On office Slack channels, managers posted media policies while employees posted the clip. Book clubs swapped novels for civics articles. The split wasn't tidy. It was human, and humans, when pressed, tend to ask for light. Anyway. On Capitol Hill, theater and process collided. Representatives Earl Maddox and Shelton Briggs stepped to a camera scrum with a sheet of paper and a practiced scowl, announcing a censure resolution against reckless insinuations that endanger privacy and decorum. Producers loved the countdown clocks. Parliamentarians frowned at the language. The text didn't prohibit oversight, it performed indignation. Still, it forced every office to decide whether to sign, stall, or sidestep. Inside the West Wing, the split widened. A leaked internal memo reported, First Lady prefers silence. President insists aggressive defense. Headlines translated leak speak into spectacle. Divide at the top. Surrogates drifted to safe harbor on morning shows. We defend families. We reject gossip. None of them touched the phrase that now framed the conversation: leverage. Protests flared without rock bands or grand stages. Albuquerque, Miami, Wichita, Bakersfield. Small congregations of neighbors with hand-painted signs. Privacy ends at leverage. Public office, public standards. Love license. One contingent in Madison held candles and printed pocket cards summarizing visitor policy norms. A nurse handed them to anyone who asked, then handed them to people who didn't. Committees stirred the way committees do, quietly. Letters crawled out of oversight printers questioning reconciled visitor logs, manifest verification, badge audits, and written policies for exceptions. Chairs told staff to avoid adjectives. Ranking members asked counsel what constitutes a lover in statute. An old-timer muttered that Washington runs on winks. A junior aide whispered that winks had just become exhibits. Agencies performed routine with unusual care. The Secret Service reviewed badge workflows. The GSA asked venues for post-event credential reconciliations. Council circulated a memo exploring appearance of influence standards used by inspectors general. Nothing explosive reached the airwaves. But calendars slowed, and doors slowed, and doors swung too freely. Donor circles, allergic to ambiguity, shifted tone. Some hosts paused receptions at properties associated with controversy. Others issued polite schedule conflicts. A boutique compliance firm rolled out a service branded proximity proof, templated affidavits, visitor attestations, and audit-ready checklists. It looked bureaucratic. Clients lined up. Then an unexpected fracture appeared. A longtime surrogate, polished, ubiquitous, Teflon, stepped to a podium and said, "I defended what I didn't examine. Voters deserve clarity." He didn't echo Obama, and he didn't name a soul. He simply said, "Standards must be standard." The clip disrupted booking grids. Producers wanted him back. Allies wanted him gone. Pollsters detected a modest but stubborn drift. Not toward a party, toward a principle. Transparency began to outscore privacy when attached to public office by double digits among independents. Focus groups in Milwaukee and Mesa repeated the same sentence almost verbatim. Adults can love who they love. Leaders can't hide who opens the door. By week's end, Carolyn Leavitt stepped to a small-town lectern and finally spoke. "I once filled silence with talking points," she said. "I won't do that again. I defended something I didn't fully understand. We owe voters clarity." It wasn't surrender, it was an inflection, a human-sized pivot that registered because it refused drama. The countdown to censure ran out of oxygen. The resolution, grand on cable, thin on paper, drifted toward committee, then toward a drawer. The letters did not. They multiplied, and with them, receipts. The institutions hadn't roared. They had done something rarer. They had listened, tightened, and abroad, allies asked discreet questions about protocols. At home, clerks, archivists, and schedulers, people whose names never trend updated forms, added initials and marked margins. No fireworks, just friction, slowed. In Washington, that's the tell. Not the shout, but the pencil mark that won't erase. It lingers after headlines. The first ripples of fallout weren't in Congress or cable studios, but in classrooms, lecture halls, and public squares. Across universities, students staged sit-ins not against war or tuition hikes, but against ambiguity. They carried cardboard signs with questions rather than slogans. What defines private when it becomes policy? And who decides when romance becomes leverage? Their occupation wasn't about confrontation, but about forcing dialogue. Professors walked past the encampments with mixed expressions, some quietly proud that civic awareness had returned, others weary of another generation discovering how fragile accountability could be. In their petitions, students demanded transparency frameworks not for scandals alone, but as a structural safeguard. They argued that if a president's personal ties could bend schedules and obligate pivots, then oversight wasn't intrusion, it was obligation. In veterans' halls, the word leverage triggered a different resonance. Retired service members stood in dimly lit auditoriums, their voices carrying over folded chairs and coffee urns. One veteran leaned on his cane and said, "Leverage is a battlefield word. We fought enemies who tried to use it to break us. It doesn't belong near the resolute desk." Applause followed, heavy and slow, like the sound of boots on parade ground asphalt. For veterans, the debate wasn't abstract. Vulnerability meant exposure, and exposure meant risk. The thought that private access could be weaponized against the presidency felt like a betrayal of the discipline they had lived by. Teachers, meanwhile, turned the moment into a civic exercise. Districts distributed accountability toolkits that included lesson plans about public office, privacy, and oversight. High school classrooms became forums where students debated whether presidents should disclose visitor logs of private companions. In some schools, teachers asked students to draft mock policies. What rules should apply when private relationships intersect with public responsibility? For once, civics didn't feel like a relic of the Constitution. It felt urgent, immediate, like a live case study unfolding in real time. Immigrant families brought their own lens to the moment. At community centers, parents told stories about years of being pulled aside for papers, background checks, and border interrogations. "We carried documents for every visit, every renewal, every step," one father said. "And yet those with the most power? Are they exempt?" His wife added quietly. "If we were checked for years, why shouldn't the powerful be checked too?" In those rooms, the debate over presidential privacy was reframed as a question of equity. For families who had endured endless documentation, the idea that the presidency could be shielded from similar scrutiny felt bitterly ironic. A new refrain began circulating, whispered first in immigrant support circles, then scrawled across social feeds. "We carry papers like armor. Who else should?" The phrase crystallized the divide. Ordinary people had lived with intrusive checks as a matter of survival, while the powerful evaded checks in the name of privilege. That juxtaposition caught fire not because it was partisan, but because it was universal. Everyone understood papers. Everyone understood power. And now everyone understood how dangerous the gap between them could be. If the cultural fallout spread like brush fire, the political aftershocks landed like earthquakes, shaking institutions that had grown comfortable with ambiguity. Small dollar donations surged into reform groups overnight, fueled by hashtags and campus rallies. PACs that had struggled for relevance suddenly found themselves flushed with contributions from ordinary Americans who had rarely written checks before. "Accountability has a constituency now," one strategist remarked grimly. Counter-fundraising, however, was just as ferocious. Loyalists blasted appeals to protect the family from what they cast as prying eyes, framing the moment as an assault not on governance but on intimacy. The battle lines hardened into wallets and receipts. Behind the scenes, the threat matrix shifted in unsettling ways. Intelligence analysts noted spikes in disinformation campaigns, some foreign in origin, others domestic but cloaked in anonymity. social feeds filled with fabricated rumors about supposed relationships, blurred photos, and out-of-connected travel logs. At the same time, credible threats multiplied, targeting both Obama and those pressing for oversight. Security details quietly expanded, routes were altered, and public events shortened. The price of transparency was measured not only in words but in heightened risk. On Capitol Hill, oversight momentum built. A bipartisan cluster of staffers began drafting preliminary outlines for hearings. Their focus wasn't salacious detail, it was structural. Visitor logs, badge protocols, donor room boundaries, and the ways personal life could warp public duty. One aide summed it up, "We're not asking who was there, we're asking why we don't know." In those committee rooms, the question had shifted from scandal to standard. Members from both parties wrestled with the optics, supporting oversight without appearing to indulge in personal smear. But the momentum was unmistakable. It's formed beyond Washington. Under the banner of same standard, unions, student groups, and veterans organizations united to push for model policies. Their demands were simple. Private lives should have boundaries when intertwined with public power. They drafted proposals requiring mandatory disclosures of recurring visitors to executive spaces, stronger vetting of unofficial companions, and clear lines between donor rooms and policy deliberations. What began as a hashtag matured into a blueprint for reform. Operational shifts followed swiftly. Major PACs, wary of exposure, returned questionable donations. Event planners inserted new clauses into contracts. No unvetted proximity, no exceptions. Compliance officers in corporations began adopting relationship risk screens, reviewing whether executives' personal ties could pose reputational threats. What had once been whispered about as gossip became codified as governance. For every headline of outrage, there was a quiet, bureaucratic adjustment, each one acknowledging that the line between personal and public could no longer be ignored. By the end of the month, the political world had recalibrated. It was no longer about whether Obama had overstepped or whether Trump's private life had been leveraged. It was about the realization that vulnerability at the highest level meant vulnerability everywhere. Cultural fire had forced political stone to crack, and in the fissures, a new standard began to take root. Barack Obama sat alone at a modest desk, the glow of a single lamp cutting against the surrounding dark. No entourage, no notes scattered across the surface, just him, steady and deliberate, addressing a nation still reeling from revelations that blurred the lines between privacy and public trust. His tone was measured but firm, every syllable carrying the weight of both caution and conviction. He began not with blame but with a reset. "This isn't about gossip," he said. "It's about how power can be bent by what stays in the shadows." He paused, letting the silence breathe before continuing. "I refuse to name anyone because this must be about standards, not spectacle. America has endured too many moments where scandal overshadowed substance, where names eclipsed the policies that should have been under debate. I will not add to that cycle." His refusal to indulge in spectacle carried its own authority. He was not trading in rumors, he was calling for accountability. Obama leaned forward, his voice softening as if inviting families into the room. "Privacy deserves respect. Public trust deserves protection. These principles are not at war with one another. They coexist, but only when boundaries are clear and when those in public office understand that their private choices ripple outward to affect millions." His words reframed the controversy into a larger truth, that governance is not only about what is written in law, but also about what is practiced in life. Then came his appeals, deliberate and layered. First to the families of service members. His cadence slowed, solemn. "You deserve a government that won't gamble with leverage. You put your lives on the line with discipline and sacrifice. You should never have to wonder if those at the highest levels of command are disciplined in return." The camera caught the flicker of resolve in his eyes. Next, his voice sharpened, aimed at onlookers, the students, the workers, the skeptics watching from their homes. "Don't cede truth to volume. Ask for receipts, processes, logs. Don't let the loudest voice dictate reality. Democracy doesn't survive on noise. It survives on proof," demanded. The appeal was not lofty, it was practical, a roadmap for ordinary citizens to seize agency. Finally, his focus turned to lawmakers. The words fell like instructions carved in stone. Codify boundaries, visitor transparency, Badge integrity. No unofficial corridors to official power. These are not luxuries, they are essentials. They protect the office and the nation it serves. He was not begging for action. He was placing responsibility squarely where it belonged, on those elected to preserve the Republic. The closing line arrived not as rhetoric, but as a distillation of everything that had unfolded. Truth doesn't need scandal. It needs sunlight. The lamp clicked off, and the screen dimmed with him. But before darkness consumed the frame, new images emerged. Classrooms where students sketched policy drafts on whiteboards, union halls where workers signed petitions, and church basements where neighbors gathered beneath the banner of "Same Standard." The movement had already begun.